Hey guys, how's it going? I hope you're all doing great, as I always say. And in this video, we got a story from my part of the country in Canada, from New Brunswick. So, if that sounds like your cup of tea, then pull up a stump for sure, and let's jump into it. Thank you for watching. This is a story of something that happened to me a few years back. I haven't told many people, and those who I did tell just dismissed me out of hand. So now I come to you, the internet. Sure, most of the people who read this account won't believe me, but I still cling to the hope that someone out there will take me seriously. Maybe someone has even had a similar experience. Anyway, here's my story. I grew up in a small town in Restigouche County, New Brunswick. For those of you who don't know, the area is a cool, mountainous region of Canada known for its beautiful forests and rivers, and it lives up to its reputation for natural beauty. The rolling hills, golden shores, and lush woods make it a pleasure to explore in the summer. However, being fairly far north, it cools down quite a bit by early autumn, which is when the event that I'm about to describe took place. As I said, I grew up in a small, friendly town, and we didn't have much in the way of haunted houses or urban legends. But one town over, a few miles down the road, there was an old Victorian-era mansion that is said to be haunted by the spirit of a woman. I always heard the story growing up, but by the time that I was about 12, I had stopped believing in ghosts and other such nonsense. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should explain the legend as it was told in our area. The spirit was known to the local kids as Old Nan, or the Shrieking Woman. Some people who thought that it was all BS would dismissively call her the Screaming Granny, while shaking their heads at the foolish people who believed in her. Now, the details of the story vary depending on who you ask, but there's the most common version. Here it is. During the 1800s, there was a local outbreak of pneumonia one winter. There were some other sicknesses like colds and flus going around as well. It was a cold, snowy year, and everyone spent their days huddled inside. Perfect conditions for a disease to spread. Couple that with the poor hygiene and primitive medicine of the time, it's no wonder that the people started getting sick. The doctor in town, and yes, there was only one, was extremely busy treating the sick and trying to slow the spread of the disease. He went up to a large house on the outskirts of town, trekking through the snow and the icy winds to check on the family that lived there. The history of this family in particular was tragic enough already. The man who owned the house had died several years earlier of an unknown medical condition. His wife, distraught at losing her beloved so suddenly, had run away to America in the hopes of starting a new life, leaving her 3 young children in the care of her mother. The last anyone heard of her, she was a drunk living in the slums of some American city, though no one can agree on which city it was. I should stress that the details of this tale are hard to verify, and I'm merely explaining the story as I heard it growing up. Anyway, by the time of this outbreak of pneumonia hit, the 3 kids were in the care of their grandmother, a kindly old woman who tried her best to hold what was left of her family together. When the local doctor made his way up to the house, which was on the outside of the main settlement, he was relieved to find no signs of disease in the family. He explained that due to the high rates of sickness in the town, and the difficulty of journeying to their outlying house in such inclement weather, that he wouldn't be back for at least a week. He was satisfied that the inhabitants of the house were healthy, and as long as they stayed home, they couldn't contract any disease. Of course, the doctor had neglected to consider the fact that he might have carried the pathogens from his patients in town up to this family. This unfortunately turned out to be the case, for even though the doctor had not fallen ill himself, he must have been carrying some sort of bacteria or virus when he visited the family on that cold, bleak day. He spent the next week or so working almost without rest to treat the ill and dying in the town, and during that week it snowed every single day. It was one of the harshest winters on record, but the doctor kept his word. and as soon as he could, he made the way back up to the old house outside of town where the grandmother and 3 children lived. Apparently it took him 4 hours just to walk through the snow that lay thick upon the road, though at least the blizzard had finally stopped. When the doctor arrived, he knocked on the door. He received no response, so he knocked again, calling out to the old woman while doing so. Again, there was no answer, so he let himself in. I don't know if the door was locked or not, but he got in somehow, and what a terrible sight that he found. He first walked through the kitchen, seeing utensils and old food strewn about haphazardly, the furniture in disarray. Now, very concerned, he made his way into the dining room, and he gasped in horror. There, in her favorite rocker, sat the kindly old grandmother, but she was a hideous mockery of her former self. She was covered in blisters and cysts, with her pale skin a gray color. Her eyes were bulged and glassy, and her nostrils were flared. Perhaps most disturbing, however, was her mouth. Her lower jaw hung open at an impossible angle. Her few remaining teeth, yellowed and worn with age, jutted out of her now bluish and shriveled gums at odd angles. The doctor felt her hand. She was frozen. She had obviously become very ill and passed away, and with no one to tend the fire, the house became frigid, freezing her disease-riddled corpse. The doctor got up and ran up the stairs, screaming for the children. He burst into the nursery to find 2 bluish, unmoving forms. He began to weep as he tried hopelessly to resuscitate one of the children, but was surprised and relieved to find that one actually began to stir. The child was frostbitten and ill, but still just barely clinging to life. His sister was less fortunate. She had frozen almost as solidly as her grandmother, and the 3rd child was missing. It is presumed that he tried to go for help in the blizzard and froze to death on the way, though, since a body was never recovered, no one could be sure. The surviving child was delirious and could not remember where his brother had gone. This one fortunate boy was nursed back to health, and eventually he was adopted by the doctor, who felt immense guilt at having carried the fatal disease to the small family. The old house was seemingly never lived in again. Anyway, that's the story as it was told to me in my childhood, and the story persists to this day, but I have yet to touch upon my own experience with Old Nan. As I mentioned earlier, I had stopped believing in ghosts, including this one, by the time that I was about 12. But later in my teen years, I developed a fascination with the occult and the paranormal. I still didn't really believe in any of it, but like most people, I enjoyed being scared. I loved the tingling in my spine when I heard a good horror story. Unfortunately, none of my friends shared my interest. You have to understand that back then, believing in, quote, fairy tales was a sign of weakness, and though my town was pretty friendly overall, some of the young punks would mock or beat up people who they didn't like. So obviously my ghost hunting hobby and a collection of horror stories made me a bit of an outcast. But I guess there are assholes everywhere you go, and people will punish those who are different. I didn't mind so much the teasing, but the fact that no one would come along when I wanted to check out these haunted locations was discouraging. Nevertheless, when I was 16, I decided to go by bus to the nearby town where this supposedly haunted house was. And like I said, even though I was a skeptic, I did enjoy scouting out creepy, abandoned locations, and a part of me always wanted to find evidence of the supernatural. I guess these days people call it urban exploration. It was a blend of that and half-hearted ghost hunting. Anyway, this would be my first expedition outside of my immediate area. After half an hour, the bus arrived and I got out. I didn't bother questioning anyone for directions. I knew the name of the street the house was on, and since I had heard the story 100 times, it was at the end of Birchwood Lane. Besides, I didn't feel like embarrassing myself by asking anybody where the town's haunted house was. After wandering around the core of the town, what you'd call downtown, with the place not so small and sparsely populated, I saw a street sign marked Birchwood Lane. I followed it. I made my way through a few blocks of modern houses, and then some older buildings, and eventually the town thinned out entirely and I found myself walking into the woods. At the edge of the woods, the road, which had been paved up to this point, turned to gravel. I sighed and pressed onward. I had brought a flashlight with me, but as the sun had not quite gone down, I felt that I didn't need it yet. As I continued the path, it got more and more uneven, and the sinking sun and increasingly thick foliage above me shrouded the narrow trail in darkness. Before I got the light out, however, the trees thinned out again, and I saw before me a large, dilapidated two-story house. By this time, the day was nothing more than a fading orange glow on the horizon, and the mansion was basically a silhouette. I'll admit, I was a bit apprehensive at this point, but it was far too late for me to turn back. I walked across the overgrown lawn, which was covered not only in tall grass but also shrubs and trees. As I got closer to the house, I could see it more clearly. There was a single door hanging from its hinges in the middle of the facade. The remains of what once was a front porch lay rotting beneath it. Above the door there was a small awning bent dangerously downward, looking as if it could give way at any moment. Only one of the pillars designed to support it still stood. The exterior of the house barely had any paint left on it, and what little did remain was chipped and cracked. Most of the windows were shattered, though only one had been boarded up. The house looked old, to be sure, though it didn't look like it had been abandoned for 200 years. If that had been the case, it probably wouldn't have remained standing so intact. I reasoned that someone or a group of people must have kept the building in shape for quite a while after the old woman had died, and it only fell into disrepair more recently. As I came to the door and climbed up over the remains of the front porch, I felt a chill run down my spine. I felt fear before, but this was different. It was more than fear. It was a feeling of being unwelcome, of not belonging. I dismissed this as paranoia, and I gave the battered wooden door a push. It was partly open already, but the wood of the door frame was too warped for it to swing freely. I pushed it again, harder, and heard a loud crack as the rusted hinges broke apart. The whole door lurched and then fell forwards. I had to jump out of the way as it nearly fell on me. I dusted myself off and I clambered inside. The sunlight was now gone entirely, and I was extremely wary of tripping over old furniture or holes in the floor. I switched on my flashlight and swept the beam over my surroundings. I was in some sort of large hallway that branched off in several directions, and at the end was a staircase. I walked along the corridor and looked into each adjacent room as I went. It was hard to tell what any of these rooms were supposed to be. Each was just a mess of exposed wooden beams, old trash, and pieces of the walls fallen onto the floors, and the pervasive smell of mildew. A few books, ruined beyond recognition, lay upon a shelf in one room. There were several broken jars on the floor as well. I made my way slowly to the staircase and I began to climb it. I was nervous, as the stairs were old and rotted and creaked loudly under my weight. Carefully, I got up to the top and looked around. The second floor was much like the first, except that it was even more uneven. This did little to comfort me, as I knew that the floor could give way under my feet and send me toppling down 9 feet to the lower floor in a pile of debris. But what can I say? I was a dumb, fearless kid. To me, giving up and going home seemed worse than risking my own neck. It's funny how teens think sometimes. As I explored, I came upon a bathroom. It looked so dated. That may sound weird, especially since the whole house was pretty ancient, but just seeing the old-fashioned pipes, the archaic toilet, and the bathtub on the little ornamental legs just seemed so quaint. I was a bit confused when I looked into the bathtub and found dark, reddish stains. While the first thing that pops into my head was the phrase bloodbath, I laughed when I realized that they were probably just rust stains. The next room I entered was truly unnerving. I recognized it almost immediately as the nursery from the story. There were 2 small beds and a small cot. For some reason, the child-sized beds were made up. They were moldy, with moth-eaten blankets, tucked neatly all around them and turned down partly at the top. I guess the last caretaker of the house had just left them like that, but it seemed so eerie to me. It was almost as if someone had just prepared the beds for the kids a few hours ago. The cot, by contrast, was completely bare. Now, if this story is making me sound brave so far, realize that I really wasn't. I'll admit I was completely terrified. The feeling of being unwanted hadn't left me. If anything, it had grown as I explored the house. As I got further from the door, my heart began pounding harder and harder, but as I said, I was determined not to chicken out and leave. I steadied myself and fought with the urge to run. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have. There wasn't much more of interest upstairs, as the other bedrooms were pretty much empty. The furniture had been mostly removed long ago. I spent about another 20 minutes upstairs before heading back to the creaking old staircase and carefully making my way back down. I realized that I hadn't yet seen all the rooms on the ground floor, and I had been eager to look for the nursery upstairs. I really felt like I needed to leave, but that stubborn part of my mind stopped me. I made my way through a few small, nondescript chambers without finding much, but then, in one of the last unexplored rooms, I saw her. The memory is still so vivid. I spent the last 6 years trying to forget what I saw that night, and now I'm recalling it, and the image hasn't faded at all from my mind. I came around a corner into a new room, and as my flashlight beam swept across the wall, I saw her face, the dead grandmother's face, I swear to you. It was only there for a second, but it was so clear. I know I didn't imagine it. Her skin was molted gray, blackened in some patches. Wrinkles and cracks covered pretty much every inch of exposed flesh. Her eyes bulged out, but they were pure white, as if covered in a film. Her lower jaw hung slack, but not in any way I'd ever seen before. It was as if her jaw was dislocated or outright broken. A few small, jagged teeth set around her gaping maw, and a swollen tongue was visible between them. Her white hair clung to her scalp in patches, matted and stained. She wore an expression that I can only describe as desperation, almost as if she was pleading for someone or something to save her from her awful fate. I really only got a good look at her face, but I also glimpsed her upper body. And while I can't be sure, I think she was clutching something in her wizened hands, a bundle. It was about the size of a small child. As soon as I saw her, I screamed. I screamed louder than I ever had before, or since, come to think of it. You know, the feeling of pure, absolute, all-encompassing terror, fear so powerful that it numbs you, while at the same time making you hyper-aware of everything around you. Some of you will know what I'm talking about. I dropped my flashlight and ran. I ran through the house, now completely dark without my flashlight. I tripped and hit a couple door frames, but remarkably, I seemed to remember the way out, even in my state of total panic, because I was outside in about 10 seconds. I just kept running, now with the moonlight to aid me. I'm not exactly sure when I stopped screaming, but by the time that I saw the outskirts of the town, a little while later, I was merely sobbing. I ran to the first house that I had lights on, and I pounded on the door. A bewildered man opened the door and I ran inside, nearly collapsing on the ground from exhaustion after running so far. My mad dash for town had left me with more than a few scratches and bruises. When I calmed down enough to speak, I told the old man that I just needed to use his phone. He still didn't really know what was going on, but he led me to the telephone in his kitchen. I got a ride home with my father. Despite his repeated questions, it took me weeks to tell him what happened. He was more upset that I had broken into an abandoned house, and to this day he doesn't really believe me or anything that I saw. And I think, whatever, I wouldn't believe me either. It was months before I could get a full night's sleep again, and even today I have nightmares about that dead, pitiful face staring out of the darkness at me. And though she made no sound when I saw her that first night, in my dreams she screams and wails. They say that memories of important or traumatic events are far more vivid than memories of mundane events. I guess that's true. I'll remember that face until the day I die. I don't blame you if you don't believe me, but I'm not the only one that's seen her. There are a handful of other unlucky people who have gone into her house at night. I heard a rumor, inside of a rumor, that someone snapped a picture at some point, but I don't have it. Maybe it's somewheres online. I don't know though, since I've never searched for it. I never want to see old Nan ever again. So, what did you think of that story? I quite enjoyed it myself. There are a lot of stories from my province about little things like that. And there are quite a few stories that definitely do date back to what I think might be the same winter. I don't know for sure. And I also am familiar with Restigouche County. I'm not super familiar with all the areas there, but I played hockey there, which sounds very Canadian. I do know of a Birchwood Lane, but it's not in Restigouche County, so that's obviously not it. If I ever do find out where that is, if I can figure it out, there's a chance that I might actually go there and I'll live stream it or something, but that's the event that I actually figure out where it is, and it's not super far away and the price of gas drops a little bit, But yeah, there are a lot of very tragic stories like that result in an urban legend or a ghost story from my province, and they're all over the place too. There's even the Headless Nun Tour in Miramichi. I actually recommend people go to that if you're ever in New Brunswick. Go to the Headless Nun Tour in Miramichi. It's at night, and they do it through a place called French Fort Cove. Other wild places are Bow Bear Island, where people were quarantined, and a lot of them died there. Some of them would try to swim back across to the city, and they would get swept away into the undercurrent and drown. So there's lots of human bones and stuff there. And I believe that was also a particularly harsh winter, the same as another area in the same city of Miramichi called Middle Island. And I've actually been there quite a few times, so if anybody wants to see pictures from there, I can go there this summer and just take pictures and kind of walk around a bit and tell the story. I think the long and short of the story is that when Irish people had came here to escape the potato famine or escape Ireland, I guess, I don't know the full story. They went there and they were held there by the British, held on that island as a quarantine. And pretty much anybody that went there was a death sentence because it was all typhoid fever, and they just left them there. There is one family, the Vondy family, I think, that was the ones who would come and sneak in and try to care for the people, but he eventually died too, so the whole thing is just an absolute tragedy. But there's a whole bunch of tourist stuff there now, so you can go there and learn the story and all that. So if that interests anybody, then I can just go there and live stream it, or I can do a video about it or something. I don't know, just tell me what you just want to hear. And actually, since I'm on the topic of stories that happened in my province, I'll just do what I do every now and then, and I'll tell one of my experiences. So if you don't want to hear that, you can just click off now. But if you do, it's only a couple minutes long, I think. So yeah. So I'm pretty sure every province or most states have this. It's a program that when you graduate from high school and you're going into college or university in the fall, you can get a job and they'll pay half your wages. So I had gotten a job with a church in the area, and just basically what I did was I did landscaping, I did mowing, I painted a little bit if I remember correctly. I did the winter wood, just like work, I guess, that you would get someone to do if you were a little bit older and couldn't get to it all. So it was my job to do these things. And one of the things I did was I mowed this very secluded graveyard. Now, generally, since at the time I had no car, I was there by myself a lot. So I was there with the mower and extra gas, and I was mowing, and everything was going by as it normally would. I was listening to some music, and then at one point I decided to take a break. And I also didn't have as much gas as I thought, so I had just sit there for a break, and then I would call the minister to come bring me more gas if he could. And as I'm sitting there, I see this girl at the back of the graveyard. This graveyard is surrounded by forest, like a pretty, where it was then anyways, a dense forest. And she's just skipping back and forth along the back row of the tombstones. She must be between 4 and 6 years old. She's wearing like a white dress and a white hat, just like fancy clothes. So at first I thought that maybe there is somebody at the adjacent graveyard, because there's two right side by side that's separated by a hedge or a fence. And I decided to go and just kind of glance into the parking area, and there's no car. So I thought, okay, maybe there's like a family that walked here for some reason, and the kid is bored and is just playing. So I look around to the other graveyard, like I look over the hedge. It's empty. There's no one there. I'm the only one in this entire area. And she's still just skipping back and forth. So I think, oh, okay then, I'm just gonna go with this and just let it be. I just mowed there and I didn't see anybody near that place. So I don't know what the hell's going on. So I end up calling the minister to just tell him that I need some more gas or whatever. And after I get off the phone, she's once again still there. So this time I'm like, okay, this is obviously a real person. So I start to go over to them and I call out to her, because I just want to know who she is, and chances are I probably knew her parents. So I start walking over to her, and she looks at me, and she's super pale, but still, like, I don't know, just looks pretty normal, I guess, just a pale kid. And then she smiles and runs back this little trail, like at the end of the graveyard. The trail only goes like maybe 30 feet into the woods, and then it stops. It was just like when you take all of the old flowers off the graves, so after they've died, you can take them to like a compost pile. That's the word I'm looking for. So that's pretty much where the trail led. So I follow her back the trail, and I just find her hat. I don't find any person. And again, the trail just ends, so I don't know where the hell she could have gone, because she was in my view the whole time, and she just vanished. So I pick up her hat, and I'm just holding it, looking at it, thinking, this is really weird. And I walk out of the trail, and the minister's there now, and he's asking me, he's like, why were you in the woods? Like, what were you doing? And I just say, I saw a little girl skipping back and forth, and she seems to have dropped her hat when she ran to the woods. And he gives me like the weirdest look that somebody could give you in that situation. He was kind of skeptical, but still just like, you're obviously holding a hat, so you got it from somewhere. And he was like, oh yeah, I don't know what you want to do with that. So I just put the hat like on the back tombstone and just walked over to him. And we talked for a few minutes about how much I got done and everything. I said I'd be done in like another hour or so. So he said, okay, just give me a call. And then he leaves. So I put the gas in the mower, and I start up the mower and turn around, and the hat's gone. And there's no trace of the girl, and then I never saw her again, ever, since any time I've been there. I kind of rambled that story off, but it's really weird. and I thought that some people might like to hear a spooky little story from my neck of the woods. So if you liked the video, then great. You can like and subscribe if you want to. There's links in the description if that's something you want to do to support the channel. And thank you for watching. Thank you for pulling up a stump, and I will see you in the next one.